We're joined in the studio today by Oleksandr Sukhoi, the head of the analytical department of the project team at the first separate Unmanned Systems Center. That's part of the Unmanned Systems Forces of Ukraine. Good to have you with us, Oleksandr. And we're looking forward to hearing about the deep strike operating landscape and your department's role within it.
I am really pleased to be here, and I really hope we are going to have a really meaningful and insightful conversation.
We are indeed. Yes, my name is Dan. I'm from Serhiy Prytula Charity Foundation in Kyiv.
And I'm Jonathan Winch. I'm co-founder of Cylinder Defense in Copenhagen, Denmark. Together, we're going to go inside Ukraine's fighting machine. Let's get things underway. Can you just give us a brief background on yourself, where you came from, what brought you to where you are today, and the role you play today?
My name is Oleksandr, and I am an officer in the first Unmanned Systems Center. Initially, my background is totally civilian. I've been working in IT industry for more than 25 years.
IT, huh?
In IT industry, yes, before joining the military. I have two educations. I have master degree in IT and I have master degree in project management. So I started about 25 years ago as a developer, and then I grew to project management role, and I was managing teams across 3 countries in Europe. So for the last 19 years before joining the army, I was working for a Danish company called Intronaut. This company is located in Silkeborg. It is a small town in Denmark, and it is funny because the first time when I met my bosses 20 years ago, they asked me, well, you probably have never heard about Silkeborg. And I was like, guys, I'm a football fan. I am Dynamo Kyiv fan. We played against Silkeborg twice, and I know exactly where this place is located on the Danish map. And they were quite surprised to hear that people ever heard about Silkeborg. But yeah, I've been working for the Danish company. I built software development teams across Europe for them. Interesting about this company is that they have some high-profile customers like royal families of Denmark, both royal families of Denmark and Sweden. In terms of cooperation, I had a really nice case in my life. I went on vacation somewhere in Mediterranean. I was drinking pina colada, and I got a message from my boss like, hey, Oleksandr, you know, the Prince of Denmark will come to your office on Monday. And I was like, what Prince of Denmark? I don't understand what you're saying. And Monday morning, or maybe noon, I am drinking pina colada somewhere in Mediterranean, and my colleagues are texting me from Kyiv. We have Prince Frederick in our office, and he's shaking our hands.
I hope that vacation was worth it.
Yeah, but the vacation was worth it. Of course, I missed then Prince, now King of Denmark, and I had the chance to meet him in person. But vacation with my family, I think, was a much better choice.
And then there was the pina colada, right?
Yeah, and pina colada. And when the full-scale invasion started, I started as a volunteer, and I had hopes that the war will finish quickly. But I think around the middle of 2024, when it became obvious that Trump would be the next president of the United States, I got the understanding that the war will continue for quite a while. I decided to make a big change in my life, which is kind of a lot of Ukrainians went through the same change, and I changed my civilian jobs to military service. And I've been in the center for a year now, because the process of joining the center actually took quite a while. It is not that easy to join a military unit when you volunteer in Ukraine, so there are some bureaucratic things which you have to come through. Now I am a part of a project team of our center. It is quite unusual thing to have in the military, because usually project team is something you have in business, but not in the military. But our war, it requires even military units to adapt quickly, to be flexible, and that's why in our unit we have a special team which is responsible for a lot of things, and as a project team we are responsible for data analysis, for automation, even such things as communication with international partners, fundraising. So basically we are responsible for a lot of things. And personally, my area, my direction which I lead is analytics and research using NATO methodology lessons learned.
When you say analytics, Can you define what that exactly means? What are you analyzing?
Basically, our unit is responsible for specific type of operations, like, for example, deep strike. And when we need to make a strike, it is not just a drone flying into Russia. It is a big process. And the process starts with receiving the mission order, then, of course, logistics. Then after logistics, there is operation itself. And then there is a post-mission reporting. And as analysts, we, first of all, we analyze every process in this chain, and we make sure we eliminate bottlenecks, and we make sure that in every part of the process, everything works smoothly. And also it is important to convert everything which we have into data. So we are ambassadors of data-driven decision-making and data-driven warfare, and that's why we are trying, when we have some specific process, we are trying to make sure we can convert it into some numbers, some formulas. And as a team which is responsible for analysis and for data, we collect data, we structure data, and then we make sure that this data can be used to make sure that the decision-making process of our commanders relies not only on their intuition, but also on the data which we collect from all the processes.
Right. Okay.
So do I get it right that First Center of Unmanned System Forces are responsible for roughly half of all deep strikes that Ukrainian armored forces send into Russian territory?
I think that's a pretty accurate estimate. There are several units who are responsible for deep strikes now, but our center is responsible for more than half of it.
And you were the first one, right?
Yes. What is the center now? It started as a battalion in 2022, and we believe, at least we don't have any information which says the opposite. We were the first battalion in the world which was responsible for drone warfare on all three levels: tactical, operational, and strategic. Then in 2023, we scaled into regiment, and in 2025, we became a much bigger structure. We became a center, and for every step, we are the first in the world. We are the first unit in the world which is responsible for all domains.
Wow, amazing.
Yeah, there could be a lot of forced design learnings right there.
Yeah, definitely.
And now that you are also doing a lot of damage for Russia territory, how your center is still operating on a tactical and operational level? Do you cover these tasks, or are you focused mainly on a strategic depth of Russian territory?
Right now, our main focus is deep strike. It is strategical level, but we also work on other levels as well.
What can you share with us about deep strike? You're striking infrastructure that's deep into Russia. You are getting through the 3-layer Russian air defense. What does that start with? The books, and then the next level will be Tor, the next Panzer. Is that how you would see that corridor?
You're right that the defense is layered, and it is not only systems like books and Tors, it is also electronic warfare, of course, on the Russian side.
We have like a basic understanding on how it's happened. And obviously, when you pick a target, which is important, very well secured by Russia, you have to plan operation ahead, and you have to do some reconnaissance. You have to collect data about how their air defense system works, how to build your road of drone, because mostly you operate with drones, right?
Yes.
You don't send rockets.
We don't send rockets. We operate with drones only.
So definitely you have some preparation stage. And are you involved on this stage, like analytical department?
In general, the targeting itself is defined on a higher level. As a unit, in most cases, we just get the mission order and then we execute it. But of course, there is a certain deal of planning and recon on our side. So you can say that we get a target and we get some basic information. Then, of course, we have our departments which collect information about security around the target, about air defense. So everything which you mentioned, it happens. And it happens on our level as well.
You have big team, obviously, and even bigger team of the drone operators who the strikes.
Well, about the scale, you can imagine that if we are responsible for more than half of all the strikes, this information is available in open source, that in March, it was the first month of the warfare when Ukraine launched more drones into the Russian territories than Russia launched into Ukrainian territory. So you can more or less guess the scale. I don't remember the official figures, but we are talking about thousands of drones a month.
You only operate with deep strikes, or you also do mid strikes?
Both.
You do both? Yeah.
Yes. Our unit does both.
Can you talk about the differences between mid strike and deep strike in terms of
Actually, there is a good discussion about that because the definition of both is a bit vague now because some people believe that it should depend on the type of drone which is sent. Some people believe it is the depth and some people believe it is the type of target. Right now, I think the common understanding within at least our unit, the first priority in this equation is the type of target and then it is the depth. So if it is operational depth or tactical depth, we can say, okay, it is a mid-strike. If it is a strategic depth, then it is deep strike. But in general, the borders between both are being raised now because sometimes you can send what could be called a deep strike drone a year ago, you can send it into some target in the operational depth. Do you call it a deep strike or middle strike?
Yeah, just more of the lines that are being blurred by this conflict.
Yes.
Can you tell me about the effect that this is having on Russia, the desired effect from your side, and then also the Russian reactions, counteroffensive measures that they're taking in light of these attacks?
About effects, first of all, we should understand that one of the things which our unit is responsible for is strategic level, and we understand that Russia now is going to keep fighting, and our goal is to make sure that Russia stops fighting and comes to negotiation table. And to achieve that, we need to work, at least on our level, we need to work both on reducing Russian capability to wage the war in terms of ammunition, jets, equipment, and also in terms of revenue they get from the, for example, oil industry. That's why when we hit the targets, we basically analyze what would be the best way to stop Russian aggression, whether we have limited amount of resources and we have to choose whether we should make sure that we hit the industries which generate revenue or whether we hit military targets, because sometimes it is not that easy to hit the corresponding target. So it is one of the aspects. It is like physical. We destroy Russian capabilities to wage the war, and we make sure that the economy doesn't have money to keep fighting. But what we noticed recently is another aspect. It is psychological aspect, because especially after successful campaigns of hitting Russian ports, what we noticed that even Russian propagandists, they started mentioning openly that, okay, guys, maybe it's time to finish this war. And that's why one of the effects which we evaluate and which we notice is psychological effect of deep strikes. We have a special person inside of our department who is responsible for monitoring both Ukrainian and Russian information space, and we evaluate it, and we have reports every day on what's happening on both sides.
Back to that aspect of counteroffensive measures by the Russians. I assume that they are moving defense equipment to the oil fields away from frontline to cope with the strikes that you're carrying out, which must have an effect also at the frontline level. What are you seeing there? What can you talk about there?
I can talk about what's visible in the open sources. For example, the commander of Unmanned Systems, Madar, he is constantly posting our videos, and not only videos from our center, but also from other military units. And he's posting videos of our drones knocking out Russian air defense on the occupied Ukrainian territory. That was, I think, a very successful campaign of this year, and obvious from the open source data, Russia is moving air defense away from Ukrainian territory because they started losing a lot of, first of all, expensive equipment. So equipment itself is quite expensive. Every Buk, Tor or Panzer, it costs millions of dollars. And besides the fact that those systems are expensive, they're also not that easy to produce because it is high tech, and it is not that easy to replace the amount of equipment they lost this year. And of course, what Russia is forced to do, they are forced to protect the facilities inside of the Russian territory, which makes it easier to do some operations on the operational depth for us, for sure. And also, you can imagine that Russia has a huge territory, and this territory in this part of the war plays against Russian interests because they have so many targets to protect. And this is one of the things which we feel is one of the goals of our operation, is to make sure that Russian abilities to defend their territory is degrading, and it opens gaps for our operations, and our operations are becoming more and more successful and will become more successful. That's our prediction.
And why are your operations becoming more successful? Because they obviously are.
One of the things is, which I mentioned, that Russia open source data suggests that they are running out of some of the air defense systems. And also we improve our tactics, we improve our drones as well. That's why we can notice that our operations this year seem to be a bit more successful than in the previous years.
Do you see that gap, the fact that you are being more successful than Russia? Do you see that gap widen? Do you think that you're on a trajectory that things are going to get better and better?
The war is quite dynamic. I would say that this war is probably the most dynamic war in terms of technology development in the history of mankind. That's why it is really difficult to predict what's going to happen in 6 months or sometimes even in 3 months. Of course, we are working hard to make sure that our operations are being more and more successful. Our drone producers, manufacturers, they are working on improving the drones, but each side can find some very effective countermeasure. And in 3 months, we can be talking about absolutely different things. So we can see the trend of the previous months when we could easily see that our operations became more successful, but I cannot predict whether the trend will continue or no. I would say that when we are talking about deep strikes, green leaves on trees are not that important. For middle strike, of course, it is an issue. We know that Russian tactics to send small groups might really become more efficient when we have leaves on trees. We are probably talking more about tactical level, and it is not our priority domain.
But this is where mid-strike could attack them before they manage to, or rather where they really accumulate the troops. You know, the formations there are bigger than they are at the front line.
Personally, I think when we are talking about mid-strike, it is more about hitting some targets which is not infantry, but for example, vehicles, and then leaves will probably not help much, because if we control the roads, green leaves on trees will not cover the vehicles which are moving on the roads. So in the respect of middle strike, I don't expect it to make a huge difference. But when we're talking about eliminating enemy infantry, of course, that will provide a challenge for us.
As you mentioned, you mainly focus on deep strike, and from the perspective of Ukraine, we cannot win Russia on the ground, on the front line. We can push them away because we see that the front line almost not moving, and mostly it moves towards Ukraine, not towards Russia right now. Do you see what else can help us in a deep strike?
What we have to understand is that one type of weapon cannot win this war. This war is quite complex. And even when we do our deep strike operations, our goal is, of course, to make as much damage as we can, but we understand that probably our operations in some time period took out 20% of Russian oil export. I remember the reports of Reuters about 40% of the capability to be taken out. But
at one moment, right?
At one moment. But we should understand that Russia is rebuilding quite quickly, and they are trying to repair their systems to make sure that they keep selling oil on the markets. That's why, of course, we should keep military pressure. That's for sure. And we should scale up our deep strike operations, because the damage which we cause gradually exhausts Russian economy. But there won't be one day when, okay, we hit something and Russian economy collapses, unfortunately. And of course, we should keep analyzing what else supports Russian economy and supports Russian ability to wage war. So, of course, we come after military facilities, military production. But what is important is that when we have create military pressure. From my perspective, it is important that our partners also help us to push Russian economy with more sanctions.
Absolutely.
We need to increase sanctions, and we also need to work together with our partners to make sure that Russia cannot avoid the sanctions. They abide them by using loopholes in third countries. I would say that it is important to scale up deep strike operations to hit those industries which support the Russian war effort on the one hand, and on the other hand, we should make sure that Europe keeps pressing Russia with sanctions and do everything to make sure that Russia cannot avoid them. And one thing I think is extremely important, it is high time to start talking about confiscating Russian frozen assets.
I think we agree around the table here about that.
Yeah, we agree around this table about any punishment for Russians because we are in Ukraine right now and we vote for Ukraine victory, obviously. Regarding the deep strike, it's a wide notion, so probably you can disclose a little bit more how you will pick your next target, the logic behind it, how it forms.
We understand that when we pick some industry, it is important to work against this industry to make sure that Russia, even when they're trying to rebuild it and fix their oil refineries, as they fix one, we hit another. So the whole chain of oil production and oil export is affected. Because if in one day you hit oil refinery and military facility, and on another day you hit military facility and some logistic hub, then it means that oil refinery has a better ability to recover and to rebuild itself. This is why the logic is we have to work against one industry. For example, you can see it by our operations against Russian ports. So we didn't hit one port and forget about it. We hit one, then another, and then the third one, and they have 4 ports through which they export their oil. And it is a campaign to target the whole industry and all export facilities.
To stop exports.
Yeah, so the goal is to stop oil export. Targeting decision supports this campaign. And talking about the depths, you mentioned that we have some targets which were hit 1,500 kilometers, 1,800 kilometers. It shows that Ukrainian drones are improved and are being improved constantly, and we expand the range. And I think this trend will continue. Russians say that no place in Russia until Ural Mountains are safe now. I think they're not far from true situation here.
You know, they have the air defense around infrastructure, around oil refineries, but then they're also implying structural defenses on storage tanks or on crane systems and things like that. Does this mean that you have to do something different? Does it mean that you have to increase the payload of your drones, or what's the idea to counter that?
The drone warfare is quite simple. Basically, if Russia has a drone which flies into Ukraine, Ukraine should defend, and the means of defense are quite limited. You either hide the target if it is movable, you have electronic warfare to avoid the drone to hit the target, you can harden the structure. So basically, Ukraine is doing this, Russia is doing the same things. And the warfare is about action, reaction, and counteraction. So we have a drone which can hit a refinery. Then Russia thinks, okay, we have to protect our refineries. They build something around it. Of course, our next step is to make sure that we can penetrate the new defense. So it is a matter of payload, of course.
Yep. And perhaps number of drones sent on a strike?
And perhaps, number of drones. Of course, it is always to make sure that the operation is successful, you have to send as many drones as possible.
Of course.
It looks like Russia didn't put so much effort to drone interceptors like Ukraine did.
Correct.
And from my perspective, we are quite successful. We have many defense companies producing different type of interceptors, plane interceptors, drone interceptors, FPV interceptors, etc. They are quite effective on the front line and on the protecting critical infrastructure from Shahid attacks. And Russia, at the same moment, using expensive air defense systems with rockets and missiles, and do not use so much of interceptors yet. So probably we will see how it ends. In a long perspective, we cannot evaluate it right now. So we have to watch it closely. I hope that they chose the wrong direction.
What I can say is that Ukrainian choice of drone interceptors was caused by the fact that we don't have own air defense systems which can be effective. We depend a lot on the systems which we get from our partners. So this may be one of the reasons why we had to invest in drone interceptors, and Russia still relies on the old SAM systems.
I also have the perspective that in the early days of the war, after 2022, that the Russians were sending reconnaissance drones up to 70 kilometers past the front line. And we needed an answer to that because they were able to, they had full visibility and they were able to pick us off.
24/7, yeah.
So the interceptors became a priority at that point. One of the waves that has meant that we had more focus on than Russia did.
Actually, what we know from the open source information, Russia started sending their recon drones even before the full-scale invasion. So several months before that, they were sending the drones inside Ukrainian territory, and we really didn't have any means to shoot them down. Now the situation is changing for better, and surely our drone interceptors are quite effective now, but still there are challenges. As usual, you can have a really nice system, like some interceptors are quite good and they have a good reputation on the Western market. When United States and Israel started their war with Iran, they felt right away that they need to protect their bases against Shaheeds, and now they have a big interest in our drones, in our interceptors. So the situation changed, but we need to scale not only the production, but also the usage of them. Because we see that we still have Shahed drones which fly into our territory and hit our targets. And that's why we need to work on both things: production capacity and improving drones, and also the logistics, training people, making sure we have enough crews to operate with those interceptors.
100%, yeah. Because we in Serhiy Prytula Foundation has the One United Fundraiser project to protect the critical infrastructure from Shaheeds using drone interceptors. So we procure them from manufacturers and deliver it to frontline brigades and units. But in the middle stage, we also train the crews how to operate on these drones, because it's improved the efficiency rate like almost twice.
Also, you can train a crew to operate with drones, but the crew also need radar, and purchasing radar systems is possible, but we don't have them enough. And I know it is a big problem for us to make sure that we have enough radars. And then we need to train people to use radars, because some crews, they have radars, but they don't know the basic things on how to use them. For example, I don't know if we can put it in the air, but it is logical that you have waves, that radar should be on a hill, but then there is a crew which is not near the front line. They're somewhere in Cherkasska Oblast, but they want to hide from Shahed drones, and they go into some holes and put radar, and then, okay, we cannot detect flying drone. Of course, you cannot detect the drone which is flying because you have hills around you.
That's a fairly basic level of understanding. I get that.
Yeah. Everyone have to work on that. The good thing is that we have a new structure in our air forces, which is responsible specifically for the drone interceptors. And of course, they're working to make sure that we have enough drones, enough radars, and enough trained crews. And it is really great that such foundations as Prytula Foundation, they help to train the crews, and they help to deliver the needed equipment to the crews.
You wrote recently an article about the vulnerability of air bases, specifically the U.S. nuclear bomber installations, and the vulnerability of those bases to the kind of drone swarm tactics that the Ukraine has been using in combat. That's quite a provocative statement to make. So what kind of response have you had on that? And can you explain your thinking behind this vulnerability?
I would say that it is not provocative. It is quite a realistic statement, because we already had numerous examples of drone penetrations on American bases. It is the incident in Parksdale Air Base. It is a recent one, but there were also drone penetrations in Langley. The threat is serious. I think this time there was no damage caused by nuclear bombers because of only one thing, because there was no payload and probably there was no intention at this step. But the hardest part of the operation has already been achieved. So the drones penetrated the bases and reached the potential targets. To put a payload on the drone and to make sure that the drone with a payload hits the nuclear bomber is now a matter of a very simple technical solution. That's why the threat is real. We also notice that besides attacks on American infrastructure, we have the same situation in Europe when some unexpected drones penetrate some military facilities or civilian airports. And about the response, it is a mixed response. There are some military specialists in the US and in NATO countries which understand that the threat is real. Again, the war in Iran shows that the threat is more than real. There are drones, also deep strike drones, which hit American bases in the Middle East. It also happens. So until recently, the official response was a mixed one. The threat is recognized, but there are no institutional changes to do something to prevent such operations. American military came to Ukraine and some Eastern European countries. They did some lessons learned about drone swarms and this tactic, and they went back to United States and they already simulated the attacks on their bases using all types of drones, starting with DJI Mavic, so-called wedding drones, and then they used FPV drones controlled by LTE, and eventually they even had fiber drones trying to penetrate their facilities. It shows us that American military takes this threat seriously. They are learning from us, and this is the part where we can actually collaborate, because what we can provide for our partners is our experience, our real battle experience, and accordingly what our partners can provide to us is their engineering capabilities and production capacity.
Obviously, to share that know-how and to share those capabilities, because obviously it's not something you can just send them an instruction manual along with some drones and they're all good to go.
YouTube tutorial.
It's using Ukrainian resources and it's using some of the people that could be on the ground fighting here in Ukraine. Do you feel that overall that's a correct and good use of Ukrainian resources to assist on the ground in the Middle East, for example?
It is a very complicated question. Right now, what we have is that not only a challenging thing to send Ukrainian soldiers to the Middle East, it is even a challenge to make sure that Ukrainian manufacturers can export the systems. In my personal opinion, we should work closely with all our partners because the war we have now in Ukraine, some people think it is just some land grab war between two neighbors. But in fact, what we have is the war between autocracies and democracies. And the trend is visible because we have Ukraine against Russia. We have United States and Israel against Iran. We may soon have a war between China and Taiwan. In this situation, probably we are already living in the Third World War. You know, when the Second World War started, no one made a mark in the calendar. Okay, it is the 1st of September of 1939, the start of the Second World War. It is highly possible that in 10 years, historians will decide that the actual date of the Third World War was actually 2022, for example. Mm-hmm. And in this respect, it is extremely important for us as a country which is fighting for democracy to share our experience. It is my personal opinion. We should let our soldiers with experience go to the countries which are friendly to us and train their soldiers. I believe that we should have the production capacity which should satisfy both Ukrainian internal demand for drones and also we should be able to supply drones to our partners.
You have your R&D department, right?
Yep.
Your own.
Yes.
Yeah. And with which drone have you started when the first center just building up?
The first drones which we used were American drones, and those drones were not usable, so they couldn't fly. And our commanders and the guys who started the first separate battalion in 2022, they actually upgraded US drones and made sure that those drones can fly and hit the targets.
Well, when you said they can't fly, can you expand upon that?
They literally were not able to fly.
All right.
They were lying in boxes, and even when guys tried to do things which were written in manuals, the drones wouldn't start.
So that was our first long-range drones from America.
Yeah, and now to the question of R&D and why we need R&D. You can imagine, in general, our unit uses drones both internally made and drones from our partners. And 95% of the drones which we use are Ukrainian made. So in Ukraine, we have a really great production capacity now, and Ukraine made a lot of good drones. But some drones are still from our partners. And you can imagine that, for example, a company in US, they make 1,000 drones, they send them to Ukraine. It takes time to deliver them, and when those drones arrive, they're obsolete. Again, because there are some changes on the battlefield, new types of electronic warfare. And if we didn't have our own R&D, what would we do? We had to send those drones back to the United States.
Or to the stockpile.
To the stockpile or back to United States. Then they would change something, send them back. A couple of months pass and we get drones which are still not operational. That's why one of the goals of our own R&D is to make sure that we can improve drones literally on the ground, and if something doesn't work, our R&D can fix those drones, can make changes to make sure that the drones are operational. And of course, we have one of the advantages of Ukraine as a weapon producer. We have a short feedback loop from the battlefield, and that's why our R&D can try something, test it quickly in the real battle conditions, and if it works, we can scale it. If it doesn't work, we will try another thing. And of course, if the manufacturer is in the United States, such feedback loop would take months or sometimes maybe years. And in our case, it may take days or weeks.
if they send you a bunch of drones and you want to improve them or to upgrade them to another communication systems, you would use it for the attacks or for your missions planning. And what is your further communications with manufacturers? Do you exchange the ideas? Do you work together on some new products? How do you help each other?
Of course, one of the things which are really convenient is to have Ukrainian manufacturers, because first of all, they can visit our missions and they can check how the systems perform in the real battle conditions. Then we have close collaboration with all the manufacturers of the drones which we use, because we are able to provide feedback quickly. We can provide them with data from the drones, telemetry, and they can make analysis of what is happening much faster than comparing to drone manufacturers from other countries. This is why such cooperation exists. It is extremely efficient, and the ways of collaboration are different from the representatives of the manufacturers presented on our missions, taking part in our missions, to the exchange of some data. It is important to make everything based on data, so exchange of data, quick exchange of data, telemetry, to make sure that some changes into navigation systems or other systems in drones can be made quickly and then again tried within a very short time frame.
We hear a lot about these units' successes. Have there been some failures where that mission that should have been successful simply wasn't? Nothing got through at all. Does that happen?
There is always a certain deal of luck, because sometimes we have a mission and no one believes it will be successful because we don't have enough drones, and we send a small bunch of drones and they reach the target. It happens. Sometimes we have a well-planned mission and of course it doesn't go as expected. And all the data shows that it should have been successful, but for some reason it wasn't. And we cannot get a clear picture why.
Someone said the other day that for every time something doesn't work, you can just blame the adversary EW.
Yes,
So
it was because of electronic warfare, yes.
Yeah.
But it happens. Sometimes missions which should have failed are extremely successful, and sometimes the missions which were nicely planned do not reach the target. So we don't have the exact information, like there was a book system or whatever, or some Panzer system which shot down all our drones, and they don't know about that as well. We have limited information about the reasons why our drones didn't reach the target, and they have the same challenge. Of course, we have assumptions, which we cannot, again, discuss publicly, because the enemy learns from every bit of information we provide, and we learn from every bit of information they provide.
What's the EW challenge, and how do you see that? Is that a growing challenge, or are you able to work your way around it each time?
EW is the main challenge, probably, and the development of the systems is extremely fast. And what we can do and what Russians do is quite simple. When we are talking about EW, it is a matter of action, reaction, counteraction. Both sides are trying to adapt quickly. We invent something, our drones become successful, Russia analyzes why, and they introduce changes in their systems to countermeasure our successes. So I think what is important to be successful in the EW warfare, both in defense and offense, is to have a quick feedback loop again, and to be able to adapt and learn quickly. So the faster you modify your systems to countermeasure your enemy, the more successful your operations will be. But the prediction is that both sides will evolve, and it will be one of the areas where the side which evolves faster will have the advantage.
Mm.
In terms of electronic warfare, as we see that this is the biggest problem for you, because you have different types of communication. Obviously on drones, it can be different, but they all rely on the radio or air communication, right? And you can send a fiber optic drones to 1,000 kilometers yet. Not yet, but probably never. So what do you think, and how do you evaluate the development of visual odometry navigation? Can it solve the problem in the future?
I know that both Ukrainian and Western companies are working on that. And so far, there is no system which would be successful in this area, unfortunately. Of course, everyone is talking like artificial intelligence, computer vision. Some systems on the tactical level, they already work and they have some success, but still manual, like FPV, is more successful than the AI-controlled drones. About deep strikes, personally, I think there should be a development in this area. It is a challenging thing, but if you can make sure that your drone doesn't depend on electronic navigation, then you will be extremely successful in your operations. Again, so far what we notice, I know that a lot of companies are working on that both in Ukraine and outside of Ukraine, but there is no successful weapon so far. There is no successful system in this area.
I saw was it yesterday maybe, being announced that in Russia they were working with quadcopter attack drones that could take off in quadcopter mode, turn into fixed wing, and then arriving at the target at the other end, and they could go back to quadcopter configuration, which obviously gives you the chance to fly with fixed wing, long distance, carry a bigger payload. So those kind of things, I'm not going to ask you if we're working on those things, but that's a pretty interesting direction.
We had that kind of configuration for drone in Ukraine. I know producers that tried it, but there is always the problem between the engines and their configurations to take a vertical fly and then to switch and use the proper aerodynamic configuration of the shape of the drone. So it was very tricky and they didn't succeed.
I think that was 2025, right, in Ukraine, but the Russians are saying that they've got that under control now. But it's still not something that's being delivered.
And we don't trust Russians.
We don't trust Russians?
Yes.
Okay, that's not new.
One of the differences between Ukraine and Russia is that in Ukraine you have private companies which compete with each other, and every company is motivated to produce a system which is actually capable to perform the mission. In Russia, they have this vertical command chain, and sometimes you have an order from your Ministry of Defense, like you need to produce this type of weapon, and there will be one company that produces it, and they have to report back that they have successful.
They did make it. Yes,
that they did make it. So if they succeed, we will see it on the battlefield, and let's hope that our companies will succeed earlier than Russians. And of course, it is important to think about countermeasures whenever we hear and we witness that Russia produces some type of weapon which is unusual for the current battlefield.
Which I'll ask, and then you can choose if you can answer it. So from your analytical perspective, where is Russia adapting most effectively in the operational depth domain? Is it in EW, or is it in defense positioning, hardening of assets, or somewhere else? And what does that mean for how Ukraine needs to keep involved?
You had a good assumption that this question is not something we can answer. I would say that one thing Russia is definitely better than Ukraine is informational warfare.
Right.
Talking about the exact things, like whether they have good EW, whether they have any evolution of their some systems, we can't talk about it publicly, unfortunately.
I have a question about your latest one, operation on Yaroslavsky oil refinery in Tuapse, which happened on 26th of April, and we are recording on 28th, so 2 days ago. Can you give us some information about these operations? How was it? Do you have some maybe after-action reviews, interesting insights or something like this?
Well, of course, we have after-action review after each operation, and when we are recording on 28th, we have latest news is that Tuapse was hit once again this night. And
this night?
Yeah, that's the deep strike I heard about first thing in the morning. I just knew there was a deep strike, but people didn't know what it was. So I guess that's...
Okay. Nice job, guys.
This brings us to the discussion that we need to make systematic pressure. And of course, we have after-action review. We analyze from satellite images what was hit. We are happy to have Russian guys making videos with burning refineries. Of course, everything is being analyzed. Then when the next mission is planned, the successes and failures of the previous missions are taken into consideration.
I've certainly taken that location off my favorite places to visit.
We saw this rain of oil falling on rooftops and streets.
Unfortunately, environment suffers, and we really pity all the fish and dolphin in the Black Sea, and we really hope that Russia eventually realizes that they have no goals in this war, and they should just finish this war and withdraw from Ukraine.
Yeah, there's a tremendous impact on the population, but I would still say that it's time the population took responsibility for the actions of the nation, and this is part of that pressure that needs to be brought to bear.
We are Ukrainians. We have been living next to Russians for centuries, and we know them better than other people across Europe, I believe. And unfortunately, the majority of population support this war. And Russia was able to conduct this war since 2014 because of one thing: the population supported it. Deep strikes, they help to make pressure on the population. And as soon as the majority of population will switch to the understanding that, okay, this war has no positive end for Russia, I think that will be the day when we will have the clear perspective of this war to be over.
That's good point.
And the closer this gets to Moscow and Petersburg, then the better.
Some of Ukrainian deep strikes were already close to St. Petersburg, but Moscow is a difficult story. I think Moscow, in terms of air defense, the most protected place on Earth right now.
The question is whether the Moscow dome is stronger than the Israeli Iron Dome?
Yeah, I think right now Moscow dome is much stronger than Israeli Iron Dome.
Wow. Okay, well, we are seeing holes in the Israeli Iron Dome now, but that's, sheer numbers and a lot of pressure there.
So regarding the strike in the Moscow, do you think it makes sense and to help us to win the war?
We had this discussion in our unit recently, and most of people say if you had to choose one target to strike and make sure it is a successful target, what would you choose? And most people say Kremlin. Mm-hmm. I am an analytical guy, and I know we have to keep pressure on the targets which are achievable for us. So I wouldn't...
So you are more rational and they are more emotional.
Yes. I am a more rational person. I think if we can hit the oil refineries and if we can knock down oil industries, then we should keep doing that. Hitting Kremlin will give Russia some excuse for just another bombing of Ukraine.
Do you think they need the reason to strike Ukrainian? They are doing their best to kill us and to destroy our cities. They don't need the reason. I don't think the Moscow will be the next escalation for them. They don't definitely use the nuke and etc. etc. But you mentioned that the social pressure is important and help us to switch Russian nation toward the finishing the war. So maybe Moscow will be one point for this.
To make sure that Moscow suffers, we need to find ways to hit specific targets which will make sure that the population feels it. For example, the recent case with Tuapse, when they had oil rain, it was visible, noticeable, and it had a really good psychological impact. Thinking about what we can hit in Moscow to make sure that Moscow population suddenly realizes, okay, we need to stop this war, it is a tough question to answer right now. I hope one day we will have this answer, but again, to be successful in hitting Moscow, we need rockets. We need ballistic rockets.
There is one escalation, though, that can happen there if you hit Moscow. And that escalation is the recruitment of troops from St. Petersburg. Mobilization from St. Petersburg and from Moscow could be justified there because they're being directly attacked. Right. So, that is a possible escalation that we would not want to see.
Yes, probably, but it looks like Putin's regime avoiding public mobilization.
They do. It didn't work well last time.
Yes. So they are recruiting people. They are buying mercenaries for money just to go to war and die for $20,000, for example. And they are willing to do this because they are coming from the poorest regions of the Russia. But it's obvious, everyone knows about it. What about the resultiveness of your strikes in long term? Can you, for example, predict how will things change in a year if you will keep your pace on striking Russian oil economy?
It is a really difficult mathematical model to be built to calculate the impact in a 1 year perspective. What we understand is that Russia is trying to do everything they can to countermeasure our actions and to protect the key sites from our strikes, and it doesn't work for them recently. What we can guarantee is that we are going to scale up our activities and we are going to increase this pressure because everyone wants this war to finish. Right now, we are in a situation when Russia demands Ukrainian surrender, but they cannot achieve anything on the battlefield except some marginal gains. Accordingly, Ukraine has no reason to surrender, and Russia has no means to win. That means that we need to push them to the negotiation table. And to make sure we do that, we need to scale up our operations in deep strike domain, and we should make sure that, first of all, Russia cannot sustain the damage which our operations cause to them.
How foreign partners or just regular people can support you on this mission?
That's a good question. Actually, as a part of a project team, I am responsible for fundraising for our unit as well. And I get this question very often, like, guys, you are such a successful unit. Why do you need to fundraise? Your government should give you everything. But what everyone should understand about the military is an extremely rigid and bureaucratical structure. And for example, we have our center, which is the first unit of this kind in the world, but all the doctrines, all the official papers, they are not ready for that. For example, every unit, they have their own table of organization and equipment, and our official structure is the structure of the mechanized brigade. And accordingly, we cannot get from the government some things which are needed for executing our activities. For example, we can probably get some infantry vehicle, but we don't need them. We need a minibus to move our crews to the starting point, to the launching point of our drones. And this is why we constantly fundraise. We have different needs. For example, one of the things we fundraise for are mobile phones, because we have this attack system, Android Tactical Awareness Kit, and we need to equip all our battle groups with mobile phones. But if you open table of organization and equipment, you do not see mobile phones as some type of equipment which should be used by military
requirement.
And of course, we are high-tech unit, and we always have constant problem with getting laptops with nice graphical card, because if you plan the road of your drone and to make sure that you do this planning work fast, you need a powerful laptop, and it is not always easy to put the laptop which costs $4,000 into this table of organization and equipment. That's why we always fundraise. We work with different organizations that help us, and unfortunately we have sometimes to focus on getting the needed equipment to make sure that our operations can be conducted.
So if we had this conversation in a year from now, do you think by that point maybe there'd be some changes there, that maybe ATAC phones are on the list of approved items?
It is a difficult question. Military structures all over the world, not only in Ukraine, they're bureaucratic, rigid, and they're slow to make decisions. And to make decisions like that, you have to go to some top levels. I really hope that we have the Minister of Defense right now, who is extremely innovative and who is a tech guy, and maybe that is the factor which can help to speed up some procurement processes.
There's a lot he's doing already to change things, so we can hope in any case that your life gets easier that way.
Yep. I think I would emphasize one thing which is extremely important. War is not the war Ukraine is fighting for just Ukrainian survival. I think more and more people in the West are now realizing that this war may spread into Europe, especially considering all the changes which are happening all around the world now. Personally, I have contacts with military from Baltic countries, and they treat the current situation quite seriously, and they are eager to learn from our experience. Also, I would say that people around the world should realize one thing. When Russians say something, you have to believe them. When Patriarch Kirill, the head of Russian Church, announces publicly that the war in Ukraine is the first step in the Russian crusade against the West, we Ukrainians tell you, believe them. Russian Church is de facto is a governmental structure. So it is not some crazy old guy is spreading some wishes which are not coordinated with the government. So when such high-profile person tells you that the war in Ukraine is just the beginning, he really means it. There is no need to attribute this message to some mysterious Russian soul, because in a lot of cases, when Russians say ugly things, people in the West tend to treat them like, okay, we should dig deeper into the mysterious Russian soul, because they literally cannot mean what they say. We have been living next to them for centuries. When they say something, they mean it. When they train the kids in schools to operate drones, it is not because they want to conquer just Ukraine. When every year they have this May Madness, when they put the kids into uniform and they paint on the cars the message "On to Berlin," they really mean it. They want to reach Berlin, and you can check the map and you can see what countries will be affected. So I would say trust Russians. We know that they tend to lie something, but when they say ugly things, trust them.
That's a really strong message. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Well, it's been really good to have you on the show. Very, very fascinating conversation, even though there's many things, of course, you can't talk about, and we totally understand that. But thank you for sharing what you could, and we wish you absolutely the very best of luck and competence going forward with the mission for the rest of the hopefully quite short period of war.
Yes, thank you for inviting. And from our perspective, we will do our best to make sure that this war finishes as soon as possible.
Thank you.
Me as Ukrainian, thank you for also not only for participating in this podcast, but also for job that you are doing, because I truly believe that your first center could make a difference in the war and come to the end.
Yeah, thank you. We are doing our best.